Good day, everyone. Thank you for attending this joint webinar. There are 488 people attending this webinar today, so we're going to wait a minute before we start so we could all join. There'll also be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so feel free to send in any questions you have during the presentation using the Zoom chat tool. So we're just going to wait a minute. Thanks for those that are joining. We're just waiting a minute for everyone to join. There were 488 people registered for this event, so we want to make sure everybody has a chance to join in today. So we're gonna kick it off now. So thanks again for waiting. So this webinar that you're attending is the Innovation Roadmap for Medical Device Development, Fostering Innovation and Optimum Programmatic Direction under Strategic Regulatory Deployment. It's being hosted by myself, Chris Montalbano, the CEO of Midi, and also hosting
Barry Sands from Rqmis.
And again, there'll be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so feel free to send in any questions you have during the presentation using the Zoom tool chat. First, to explain about Midi, who we are and what we're about, being expert in medical innovation. So we have over 50 years of development experience. We have cross-functional teams across various disciplines, from electrical to software to Internet of Medical Things, mechanical and manufacturing, engineering, and industrial design, with all prototyping in-house. We've completed decades of successful healthcare, medical, device, and disposable design. We've clocked over 10,000 hours of research in hospital, clinic, and healthcare laboratory environments, and have refined and developed a proprietary process of R&D called Development DNA, which is implemented under a formal design controls, meaning FDA, QSR, and ISO 1345. Also very important under the umbrella of Development DNA is DFX. You'll hear that a lot during this presentation, which we call Design for Manufacture, Design for Assembly, to optimize the margins of the device, to make a business out of it. And we're believers in executive program management and communication, and the concept of production, sourcing, qualifying, and managing medical contract manufacturers.
And a little bit about Rqmis. We've been in business since 1996. For those of y'all that have a little background in regulatory, that was about the time the Medical Device Directive was going into force. And we pride ourselves as providing our clients advanced implementation of device and biotech regulatory quality system and clinical operations support to accelerate that development and maximize product value. We're located here just north of Boston, as well as we have offices in Barcelona, Spain, and London, England, where we are authorized representatives both for the EU and the UK. We have 10 employees, 9 of those being consultants that have varying degrees of experience. All of have come both from the pharmaceutical, the device, as well as the combination product industry. We also have, in myself, a former senior scientific reviewer with FDA. We also have a former Boston Director of Compliance for the FDA that works with us. And as I said, a multitude of experience, both in large to small startup medical product companies. We pride ourselves principally that we're the virtual regulatory quality and clinical group that can help support that small company that they themselves have challenges in resourcing out. But most importantly, we provide that strategic input to understanding what's the best market for your product from a regulatory and clinical reimbursement standpoint, and provides that strategic insight as well as the ongoing support for regulatory, clinical, and quality.
And often Midi and Rqmis are teaming together on efforts. And today we're here to offer you some insight on how we approach medical device development, infusing innovation into it. So the agenda, just going through that. So first we're going to hit the paradigm shift in medical device development. What is that paradigm shift? Second, defining device innovation and what characterizes the innovative devices, or what are the characteristics of it. Then we're going to get into the innovation roadmap, which helps set the pathway towards innovation, yet also compliance at the same time. So the strategic development of medical devices using Development DNA's innovation roadmap has 3 stops along that roadmap and is paired with Rqmis's regulatory approach. And on that roadmap with the 3 stops, there's stop 1, 2, and 3. Stop 1 is discovery research, uncovering healthcare opportunities. Stop 2 is technology innovation, the agile R&D process. And stop 3, commercialization and implementation, preparing for market under regulatory controls. And you'll see when we talk about stop 1 and stop 2, this is not under design controls and risk management. As Barry will mention, it's called the sandboxing stage, really allowing the innovations to yield themselves. Stop 3 is where we take those sandbox concepts and then commercialize them under design controls and risk management. Next, we'll get into the strategic development disciplines with methods deployed during that stop 3, commercialization and implementation, show some case studies, and then wrap up with Q&A. So first, what I'd like to do is define the paradigm shift in medical device development. What is this paradigm shift as related to medical device development on the innovation roadmap? So there's 2 things to mention. So one is the common perception in the industry that the medical regulatory design controls and risk management, meaning FDA, QSR, and ISO 1345, are often viewed as a mandate, a process that will inhibit device innovation. The perception shift, as we call it, is using the recommendations, meaning called the FDA guidance, and the regulations, design control and risk management, as a viable medical device development innovation platform, giving a properly outlined innovation roadmap, which Midi calls its development DNA approach. So as a result, the FDA guidance is designed to cooperate with developers, encouraging innovation. So just to talk about this a little further, there appears to be some trepidation in the industry about the process of developing a medical device because of what some assume is the complicated process of satisfying the FDA requirements to make a device market ready. The FDA not only, I will call it, quote unquote, prescribes the detailed method by which to step through a medical device in its development process, but also wants to see that the company associated with the developments have minted this process into their quote unquote essential DNA, meaning the process is documented within the organization's QMS, or quality management system. That QMS has a manual which points to a multitude of SOPs, meaning standard operating procedures. And many of these procedures deal with the very product development realization process we are discussing today. So Midi's innovation roadmap, which again is called Development DNA, is minted into its QMS and consistently deployed for every client. So let's define device innovation and what characterizes innovative devices. So we've been referencing the word innovation multiple times. So let's define what device innovation means. So device innovation is the process of translating an invention into a device, i.e., quote unquote, commercialization, which creates value for the user. It must, number 1, satisfy a specific market user need, either an unmet need resulting in a first-of-a-kind device, or an existing need resulting in an augmented device, meaning a superior satisfaction of the need. Number 2, it needs to be reproducible at an economical cost which the market will bear or accept. Number 3, be effective, including the functional performance and the ease of use. And number 4, be safe to the user and the public at large. So decomposing this definition a bit further, the areas the FDA are most interested in is that it be effective, for its intended use, which includes functional performance and the ease of use, and be safe to all stakeholders, both caregivers and patients. So the FDA prescribes the detailed method of achieving effective and safe, but also has recommendations or guidance on how to perform earlier stages, or stops as we call it, on this innovation roadmap journey, which includes the market exploration and the technology innovation and R&D. So during this webinar, we will make stops along this innovation roadmap and decompose these stops, describing activities deployed which yield innovation while conforming with the FDA QSR and ISO 1345. This is the paradigm shift, and our goal is to convey how one can have a change in perception as related to realizing the FDA's recommendations and prescriptions are structured to yield innovation as opposed to quote unquote stunt it or diminish it. Now, again, now we're about to get into the specifics on the stops, stop 1, 2, and 3. We described what those stops are. Stop 1, we're about to get into discovery research on uncovering healthcare opportunities. But before we do that, we want to present a high-level timeline graphic showing the sequence of the stops in the regulatory test. This will visually demonstrate how events are not all in series, but are in parallel. Thereafter, we'll take a deeper dive into each stop on this innovation roadmap.
Thank you, Chris. So to introduce this innovation roadmap and the 3 stops and kind of the view that we've seen over the years in watching the FDA both develop and implement design controls along with ISO 1345, of course, and its evolution over the years. I think over time, some companies and some development groups have tended to take a view of let's delay design controls as far and as long as possible. It's an understandable to some degree kind of reaction, because I know most engineers, including myself as an engineer, are not particularly excited about whipping out the Excel spreadsheet or the Word document and writing a bunch of documents. So what we're trying to present today, Chris and I, is a process that we actively deploy that we find, I think, can allow an organization, a project team to better ease into design controls and actually, hopefully, something we believe, see the benefits of design control. And that is in this graphic we have here, where we have this line right slapped in the middle here. This is clearly where we're trying to convey where design controls begin. And in stop 1 and stop 2, and even at the beginning of stop 3, there's not a need to have formal design controls, but that fact alone should not drive you to not use some of the tools that will help you through the concept, requirement, and development phase, technology development phase. And these will be the tools that ultimately you will need to use when you do go into formal design controls. But what we're suggesting is, as you do the research and you interview the surgeons, the clinicians, the support staff, or whoever the customer may ultimately be, and you're developing these user requirements and design inputs, use the tool now to capture those items. And one of the tools that we use, there are many out there, of course, is Matrix. And so by establishing that tool set for you to capture these items now, instead of waiting until stop 3 gets started, what you will find is, 1, you'll find better communication amongst the project team. You'll get more cross discussion, debate, maybe even a little bit of arguing as to the requirements that the company is truly trying to achieve. And that when you do hit that wonderful line where the design controls begin, you literally publish what you've already created as version 1. And so as you're entering and crossing that line, you have your first formal controlled version of design inputs, user requirements, and your initial risk assessment based upon those inputs. So that's really what we're trying to capture in this graphic. And that, of course, when stop 3 really gets into the meat of it, yes, you're going to be in formal design controls. but you'll have a QMS developed that will help you establish that process. And then, of course, stop 3 will continue on with verification and validation of your design and ultimately commercial transfer into manufacturing. So conceptually, think about this, understand, don't be fearful of the documentation, as I like to say. Use a tool set that automates it or at least makes it easier, and start using it a little bit earlier. But recognize whatever you do through stop 1 and stop 2 is not auditable by FDA nor the notified body, simply because it occurs before your formal design controls occur. All right. Next one. There you go.
So getting into the specifics of stop 1 and talking about that, the discovery research, uncovering healthcare opportunities. So the FDA is absolutely a team player encouraging the process of medical device development. They don't want to impede the process of medical device development. They want to encourage it in a way that makes business sense for your company, which is why they provide the recommendations of performing what we're calling stop 1 on this innovation roadmap. Market exploration, discovering opportunities. So there's a time to sandbox, and then there's a time to hunker down, buckle down, and commercialize. And the FDA recognizes that. So the FDA wants the device development team to think preemptively, okay? Although realize the FDA has an additional objective in mind for this stop 1. If we were to look ahead on the journey down the innovation roadmap, we'll see that once regulatory controls are required to be put into play within the medical device development process at stop 3, which is commercialization, there will be properties and information derived from these initial unconstrained stop 1 and stop 2 activities, which act as the framework to inform the design controls and risk management process and allow the development team to stay on track with the collection of requirements to feed that process. So in essence, the FDA realizes that at stop 3 under regulatory controls, the development team would become like a ship without a rudder if the stop 1 of market exploration was not performed and or not performed effectively. So the FDA has our back and interested in seeing corporate success in the medical marketplace. Now, of course, the FDA wants the device to be designed to be effective and to be safe, which are the 3rd and 4th characteristics of device innovation that we defined before. And that's where stop 3, commercialization and implementation under design controls, is all about addressing these 3rd and 4th characteristics. Now, the 1st and 2nd characteristic of the device innovation involving a company discerning specific market and user needs while doing this at an economical cost that the market will bear, providing profit, is quite an important first step. Actually, it's an absolute must, and is setting the stage for establishing what we call a value proposition or a value handshake between the corporation and the external stakeholders, the stakeholders being doctors, patients, purchase decision makers, insurance agencies, and others. So if the bidirectional value is being exchanged, you're preparing for a successful journey. Now, as related to that value proposition, it's important to define that in stop 1. There's the external stakeholder needs and the internal stakeholder needs. So we'll decompose that. So it's important to start with exploring methods to obtain external needs. That is often what unlocks innovation and competitive differentiation. Important methods that Midi deploys in this regard are target market identification, weighed against your corporate goals and objectives, ranking the target markets and hitting the top tier markets first. Then external stakeholder identification for your company's target market. This is the first step in gathering external needs, which is identifying the stakeholders. And as we just mentioned, those stakeholders are various players, from the doctor to the patient, to the gatekeepers, the purchasing agents, insurance reimbursement, and others. Then there's VOC, voice of the customer, getting out there in the field to observe the environment and discern current clinical needs and to explore the prospect of unmet stakeholder needs. Also, user interaction analysis is an important view. Firsthand unspoken needs that may be revealed during field studies. And then workflow analysis, task mapping, and usage ceremony analysis is key to seeing what is being performed by each stakeholder, pre-use, during use, and post-use. So each stakeholder has their own workflow. For example, a doctor's workflow will be different from an assistant. So Midi deploys research methods and tools when discovering and uncovering internal stakeholder needs, meaning the internal needs of its clients from a business perspective, to strategically position them in a way where they are pursuing an innovation direction that will yield profit and a defendable market position via strategic differentiation. And some of the methods we use there are competitive market analysis, so tied to ranking and rating analysis of device solution attributes to identify gaps and unmet market opportunities or insufficiently addressed clinical needs. Swot is another tool used to identify the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of your company, weighed against your competition or lack thereof. This will help identify your call to action or the ideal go-to-market trajectory. So this all feeds the MRD, the market requirement document. So once the external and internal data is collected and analyzed, the MRD is established, and this sets informed direction for the next stop on the innovation roadmap, which is stop 2, technology innovation and the agile R&D process. But as Barry mentioned, while you're going through the stop 1 process, you need to be preemptive. Now, referencing back to one of the FDA's objectives, it's important to think preemptively so that you utilize stop 1's discovered market requirements in the design control document to be deployed in stop 3, commercialization and implementation. So now is the time to start feeding the requirements into stop 1 in a repository to be later used as the beginning of the design control stage. So at Midi, we use that tool called Matrix as our design control document during stop 3, and that serves as the repository for collecting these requirements during stop 1, not necessarily acting on them yet, but collecting them. And as we mentioned, we need to focus on the stakeholder needs in a field context, and you need to have the identified workflow, task mapping, usage ceremony to make a innovative device moving forward.
All right, thank you, Chris. So in stop 1, from a regulatory standpoint, I think some companies don't always consider this, but it's definitely the earlier you can, the better. I think in the experience that I've had over the years, especially working at a couple of startup companies, it was actually a bit of a surprise to me way back then, but it makes total sense today that the 2 most common things that are brought up typically at stop 1, especially from the investors, whether they're angel-related investors or more larger size firms or companies, is they want to know intellectual property, of course, of the product, but they also quickly want to understand the regulatory strategy and plan. These are critical points to be brainstorming with the development team to understand, kind of maybe a little bit in reverse order here. 1, what markets are you shooting to address? You may find from a regulatory standpoint that one market is a bit easier, has a bit of a lower hurdle to be able to enter that market. But of course, you have to weigh that against to the potential sales or the potential benefit of gaining access to that market first. Weighing that against, of course, those markets that are going to take longer, but of course, achieve a larger revenue stream for you. But once you understand the markets you're looking at, the intended use and indication for use are 2 items that need to be thoroughly vetted, obviously internally as well as with your potential customers. And just to quickly distinguish between those 2 terms or phrases, intended use is essentially what your product is going to do. Your knee prosthesis will replace a human functional knee to restore biomechanical motion and support. That's an intended use of a knee prosthesis, but the indication for use of that prosthesis may be or will be defining that clinical population that's recommended to have your technology. All patients over 18 years of age, non-osteoporotic, so forth and so on. So these are important to talk about them now because they're also going to react or interact with the marketing claims. So if you have a carotid stent, of course, you know what the intended use of that is. There's going to be a patient population defined, but certain marketing claims will be almost equally important. Restenosis rate. What is it you want to claim on that? Obviously, it will have to be based on clinical objective data from a clinical study. So all of these things need to be discussed internally as well as with your customer to really understand how it's going to impact the strategy. It may be you have a combination product and you need to determine whether you're going to be principally dealt with as a drug by the FDA or a device. All of these things are so critical to flush out in stop one. And then lastly, the insurance reimbursement environment. We can develop, as they say, a widget that does wonderful things, but if the insurance company doesn't want to pay for it, you're probably not going to make a lot of money from it. So these are other things that go into the regulatory strategy. And then on really the balance, I guess, on this slide is to understand that as you develop that strategy, it's not going to live in isolation. You're going to have to understand how it interacts with your IP, your insurance reimbursement, and time to market. You know, one intended use may take 6 months, another one may take 6 years. So you need to define for yourself how much of the apple you want to bite off on initially and how many further bites you want to take away from that. Okay, Chris? So to go back to the point that was made earlier in this webinar, which is deploying tools that will help you through stop 1 and 2 and really preempt some of the work that you'll have to do in stop 3, and that is pick a tool set, the tool set that you're going to use to develop your design, and most importantly, how you're going to capture ultimately those design control activities like input, output, verification, validation, and so forth. Use these tools. Use them before design control. This is your time to use them to the project team's benefit, and you don't have to fumble and figure out how to use them after design controls begin. Second of all, it's very advantageous in that I've seen too many project teams work very hard, do all of this work in stop 1 and stop 2, and then all of a sudden stop 3 hits them. And then, oh, okay, now we got to stop and take 4 or 5 weeks and start capturing design inputs. And we got to do our first risk assessment. Again, things that you could have already started as part of your natural process of stop 1 and stop 2. Now, the other aspect that we haven't talked about yet, but is important in stop 2 is for you to begin developing your quality management system, your QMS. Because of course, in stop 3, you're going to need to begin working with design controls and risk management. So in stop 2, you really want to be developing processes and establishing them for design control, risk management, and change control, with the additional consideration for supplier management, depending on how much of your work is being done outside by service providers. You want to get this set up, usually only takes about 60 to 90 days, quite frankly, but you want to have it operating and implemented when you're entering stop 3.
Now, jumping into stop 2, what is stop 2 all about? Technology innovation and the agile R&D process. So with the data at stop 1 collected and analyzed and compiled into MRD, we're ready for this next stage. And like the first stop, the FDA excludes this second stop from the regulatory control requirements, recognizing the exploration of development opportunities, methodologies, and technologies performed is quintessential to success. So although shortly Rqmis will describe how to preemptively prepare yourself strategically within stop 2 for regulatory considerations, we're going to get into the design and engineering side of stop number 2. So now stop 1 revolved around solidifying the specific attributes of a device. Many tools and methods will be employed during the process of stop 2. Some of the tools that we deploy during stop 2 are discovery research. So it's Midi's methodology known as their engine for identifying, collecting, and qualifying the challenges, technological vectors, influencing agents, and relevant facets for medical device success. And one such tool that allows the team to ascertain project development and technology parameters better, as well as further discern user needs in their environment, particularly when developing and defining user needs and environment. It's a crucial stop 2 activity. So for any device to be successful, it must have a proper user product experience and well-planned human-machine interface, which encourages correct usage and compliance while promoting meaningful product lifestyle relationships and positive experiences. Now, the systems analysis is performed and an associated report is created utilizing all of the previously collected information that defines the proper means of formulating, prioritizing, and documenting all the R&D data, yielding a highly detailed understanding of the engineering and design requirements. Through this, research and discovery may be oriented in a targeted direction leading to particular innovations. So also IP creation, generating sustainable value with IP. Exploration of technologies, materials, and engineering approaches is key. Achieving device functionality and preemptive efficacy in this stage. And identifying opportunities to achieve optimum profitability with enhanced margins through DFX opportunities. Now, with R&D directives in place, iterative exploratory device conceptualization is paired with the technology research, which involves generating and fabricating engineering proof of concepts, which are then subjected to internal testing. Additionally, external usage studies to test human-machine interface quality and HFE, meaning human factors proof of concepts, are deployed. So repeating this process in an agile format will establish a feedback loop of proof of concepts refined under agile sprints that will eventually result in multiple iterations to be documented in preparation for commercialization at stop 3. Now, just like in stop 1, we're being preemptive with a repository to collect information. It's important to think preemptively so that you utilize stop 2's discovered device requirements in the design control document to be used ultimately in stop 3. Now is the time to start feeding the device requirements captured in stop 2 into a repository. We'll continue to use our tool called Matrix as a repository for requirements during this stop 2, and it serves as our design control document, again, during stop 3. So when we're testing the proof of concepts, we're using what we call our quality first umbrella loop, and we'll go through that more in the next webinar. And then Barry will review the regulatory side of things here.
Yeah, so in stop 2, hopefully you do have that regulatory strategy in hand. It's been vented, at least initially. But as you continue to investigate and confirm your audiences or your customers' needs and so forth, you don't want to forget about continuing to update your regulatory strategy. It is not uncommon at all, of course, that as you learn and understand your market better, things change. Intended uses can either become more aggressive or less aggressive. Populations that are going to be treated can change. And so all these things should be constantly in the back of your mind as you're going through stop 2 and you're updating that regulatory strategy. It's not uncommon at all when we work with clients, they'll have a technology that's quite cutting edge that can be applied in multiple applications. And we will work with them from a perspective of, look, this is your most benign application from a regulatory standpoint. Your hurdles are the least here. You need, of course, to consider and tell us, yes, but that intended use won't get us any revenue at all, or it'll get us something quite trivial, and we must be more aggressive. So it's this normal yin and yang that's going to go on during this phase. You're going to have debates, I'm sure, with investors. You're going to have debates with internal folks. But as you have these debates and things change and moderate or get more aggressive, go back to your strategy, because you may literally go from being a combination product with the medical device primary mode of action to what the agency will consider a combo product with a drug primary mode of action, which I promise you will dramatically change your regulatory pathway and the cost and the timeline. So these are things to never forget about. The other aspect to consider is, as you're establishing the design inputs, your design inputs include what I call third body requirements. So if FDA is requiring you, or the European authorities are requiring you to comply with 60601-1, that's an input. That's a design input that you need to meet. So don't forget about those things. And then lastly, as we mentioned earlier, from a quality system development standpoint, you're designing and implementing those areas I mentioned before in the QMS and making sure they get established and folks are trained on them by the time you hit stop 3. Tris?
So jumping into stop 3. So now we need to buckle down. Commercialization and implementation, preparing for market under regulatory controls. So using the informed proof of concept test results and the requirements that were fed preemptively into the matrix during stop 2, we jump into the regulatory guidance, meaning the FDA, QSR, and ISO 1345 overlay on the program. Again, those didn't need to be deployed under stop 1 and stop 2. But now that we're into stop 3 and deploying this, we need to start executing on planning, appropriate planning according to ISO 1345, the design controls and risk management. Again, we use a tool called Matrix Requirements. It's in the cloud. Planning, and in your design controls, accommodating for the verification and validation and the traceability of that with each of your requirements and design inputs. And building out that design history file and maintaining it, and making sure you have preemptive design review meetings and performing those. We do this in an agile development sprint fashion. So with the alpha prototypes, we're going through, and once the alpha prototypes are created, we're verifying it against the design control document. And for the beta prototypes, which are really AKA pilot production off tooling, we're going through and doing verification and validation, field validation, all traced back to the design control document. So Barry?
Yeah. And so most of these points are kind of reiterations of what we've brought up, but just to hit upon these again, stop 3, you need to follow these processes. You need to have them established at stop 3, all right? Because remember that any development testing that will be ultimately going into the design control or design history file, or ultimately in a regulatory submission, has to be developed under a design control process. In the US, risk management is not so heavily discussed in the GMPs, but FDA definitely endorses it, whereas 1345, of course, risk management is defined throughout your QMS. So again, I'm going to kind of repeat the same old soapbox. As you go through stop 3, you're going to, of course, be updating the inputs, but hopefully not so much now that you're into stop 3. If you've taken the recommendations of doing what we suggest doing in 1 and 2, then this won't be so hard to implement the first versions. With those inputs, you're going to have now a plan established according to the GMP requirements. I'm sure you've had one before this, but now it will be formally controlled. And then hopefully coming out of stop 3, you're going to freeze, or into stop 3, you're going to freeze that prototype design and begin verification and validation. Okay, Chris?
So as related to stop 3, we're going to give you a little preview on the disciplines, the strategic development disciplines and methods that are deployed during stop 3, which we will be taking you on a deep dive in the next webinar. But so we'll give you a preview of that. Then we're going to go into some quick case studies and then do Q&A at the end of this. So in stop 3, some of those disciplines and methods that are deployed to really yield innovation and success in the program: the usability analysis, the ergonomic analysis, industrial design, mechanical manufacturing engineering, electrical software engineering, and of course, this is based upon the particular device or the device's needs. The IOMT, the Internet of Medical Things, DFX analysis, and then regulatory management and submission. So again, as I mentioned in the next webinar, we'll outline in detail stop 3 strategic development disciplines with methods deployed, including the regulatory approach, but for now, we'll provide a brief preview. So usability, meaningful product relationships. So getting the user to really embrace the device. If it's not used and it's not used effectively, then you're going to have an issue from a regulatory perspective, but you'll also have a market issue in getting the product embraced and having it sell. The ergonomics of the system. The ergonomics depends on if the device is intimate with the user, meaning let's say a wearable, or whether it's more static, let's say tabletop. If you need to hit on all fronts and it's wearable, there are multiple ergonomic disciplines that need to be covered in the design. So it's really the science of fitting products to people. The industrial design, this is where the innovation breakthroughs come through. So coming across with that proper form factor and aesthetic to allow the user to embrace it, which also enhances usability of the system too. The engineering at the heart of the innovation success. And again, addressing multiple disciplines from this regard and always thinking about the DFX of the system. The electrical engineering, powering development process, considering the embedded system design and then the firmware and software that needs to be programmed on it. The Internet of Medical Things. This is the chance to introduce a service component to your system. So not only the device, but having it serviced in the cloud on an app. So we go through the strategic approach on how to approach this and to yield innovation and additional revenue stream from your device, if applicable, and the implementation approach to it. DFX, cost down, optimizing time, money, and reliability. So thinking about how to optimize your margins on the device, how to design for simplicity from a manufacturing perspective to minimize the investment up front is very important. And then
yeah, and these moments or these topics here are just reminders for you that as you're going through this stop 3 in particular, but developing the testing and so forth, just don't forget to continue to update that strategy. Keep the project team, design team up to date with any current regulatory requirements. And as the design changes, that regulatory person on your team should be really telling you whether you're having substantial changes to the plan based on the changing regulatory requirements. So very important to keep that open. And, you know, the submission process, we'll get into a little bit more detail when we get into the second webinar, but specifically, obviously, the testing that's going to be coming out of this process will either guide a successful submission or one in which that you'll have challenges with the FDA. Chris? Oh, yes. So, yeah, if you can bring up that first case study. So this, and just briefly, but I think this is a great example of a product that, I put the label stop 2 and stop 3 there specifically just to give you a sense of the device and what it looked like according to the progression that we just covered. Stop 2 is, and the product, I should say, this is a product that's intended to be used with a EEG cap that works with it, that allows the user, the EMT person, to determine the potential for having a stroke or a large vessel occlusion. And the device on the left you see there is a device that was developed in the sandbox through stop 2 without any formal design controls. But then as it was progressing into stop 2, into stop 3, the design controls were deployed. In my thoughts, it would, I think, even been more advantageous to apply these tool sets that I mentioned before a little bit earlier. But the point here is a fairly complex device, software-based device, electronic device, a software device with machine learning built in, was able to follow this process, and the developed product on the right, which is in stop 3 as we speak, is the product that's currently being validated. So it's in validation. So it really shows that going through stop 2 without clear controls from a design control standpoint, but yet still considering the tool set that can be used, was developed into stop 3 and is in validation, and fingers crossed looks very successful. Chris? Oh, Chris, I'm not sure if you're muted or not.
Yes, I was, Barry. Thanks.
No.
Thanks for the heads up there. So this is a device that's currently in stop 2, getting ready for stop 3. So it's still in the sandbox, and it's the stim clip. It stimulates an auricular branch of the vagus nerve, and based upon different proprietary stimulus protocols, it provides a method of treating patients with high blood pressure, depression, tinnitus, and is paired with an app and utilizes biomarker information to provide for a closed loop feedback control system. So it's a pretty innovative device. It recognizes the fact that the body is a bioelectronic circuit, and going through clinical trials, right, or informal trials right now, I should say, collecting further data in the proof of concept stage to prepare it for stop 3, which will be the commercialization and implementation. Now, before we move into the Q&A, we'd like to conclude by saying, following an innovation roadmap-like process and integrating it into your quality management system and providing sandbox creative space in the beginning to ideate and innovate, yet not under design controls and risk management, is key. This will free up your team to explore what resonates within the market with development of creative proof of concepts addressing efficacy. Now, thereafter, using the requirements defined in the sandbox stops, meaning stop 1 and stop 2, to inform your commercialization process under design controls and risk management, preparing a design that addresses DFX, meaning design for manufacture, design for assembly, and is ready for clinical trials, preparing you for a successful FDA submission and a successful market launch. So now we will enter our Q&A session to answer any questions that are out there. I think the first question, this you might be able to best address this, Barry. It asks, what are some of the features and advantages of the tool called Matrix that's been mentioned? Oh, now Barry, it's my turn to tell you that your mic is muted. Touche, right?
Thank you so much, Chris. And yes,
Yeah.
very good. Yes. So yeah, what I have found using Matrix now in at least 3 projects is it fits very nicely, especially for the smaller organization. It has a very intuitive interface that really directly links things like inputs uh, to the risk, to the verification, to the validation, and really the huge advantage, quite frankly, is the efficiency of it. If you've ever had to do a traceability analysis or table to link all those things together for a fairly complex product, let's say the device that I showed you in the couple of slides before, that's very laborious. If you're going to do it through an Excel spreadsheet or something of this nature, when you use a tool like Matrix, when the traceability is all set up at the very beginning, to publish these traceability matrices and so forth is very straightforward. And especially when you're dealing with software, where now you've got to take design inputs and relate them to software requirements, which then go into a software hazard analysis, all these things that FDA is going to ultimately want to see, as well as your notified body. It just really makes things much more automated. Secondarily, although I would argue it's also an equal primary, is it really gets your team to begin collaborating, not just in the individual meetings that you have to discuss inputs and so forth, but it's also having it right there as they put data in, they can see the other inputs, and it really helps that cross-fertilization amongst your team. So those are just some of my thoughts on Matrix.
And if we don't get to all your questions today, we'll certainly collect them and reach back to you. Another question was from Tara in Houston, Texas. The question is, where do you find your inspiration for innovation, and does the FDA compliance damper this innovation? And so, we've configured our development DNA process to not only comply with the FDA, but also to yield innovation design results. So in this regard, one area of innovation inspiration is in observing user needs and workflow environments and the use of direct or indirect competitive systems. And the documentation of user requirements is an FDA requirement, and we preemptively collect them, as we explained in the various stops. So thanks for that, Tara. Barry, we got a question here from a person whose last name is McCarthy. For some reason, I can't see their first name, but it says, have you seen devices that use a 2-tier strategy for regulatory, meaning, for example, one for a general tool type claim, and then a second for a desired marketing claim? In your experience, is this approach more cost effective?
So yes, we've definitely seen strategies deployed. In fact, quite frankly, there was one we worked on, I think it was probably 2 years ago, where the technology, without getting into a lot of detail, it was in the diabetes market, the diagnostic side of it, where their technology literally had 4 different applications. The gold standard, you might say, the grand slam to diagnose diabetes was clearly their most cost intensive pathway. However, equally, we found a pathway because of the entities that they measure, that they could also be a device that could tell you whether or not you were in ketosis. Well, a device that tells you whether you're in ketosis doesn't require a 510K. It is absolutely a medical device. There's no doubt about that. However, FDA's viewpoint of that use and that intended use is, in so many words, they don't want to see a 510K submission. They think the risk is so low, it's just not, you might say, worth their time, which I would agree with. So yes, we can definitely, we see and we develop multiple plans. Whether or not it's cost effective, that's going to be where the devil is in the details, right? So in the example I just used, if there is research to show that, oh yes, there's a demand of 10,000 in sales per month for the next year for a ketosis device like this, then by all means, that makes a lot of sense to start pursuing that first, because the revenue generated there is going to very much fund that clinical study you're going to need for the more significant claims. But I don't want to say this is a panacea for everything, because you will find some of those lower hanging fruit intended uses that just won't develop a whole lot of revenue for you, or it's going to cause you to have a lot of investment money to get that revenue back. So yes, definitely the two-tier strategy works, but it's on a case by case depending on your product and what those different uses are.
So we have time for one more question, and then we're going to have two important wrap-up comments to tell you about some upcoming events. So next question is from Rakesh in Cambridge. He says, what are Midi's preferred embedded system design and mechanical design software packages when doing medical device development? So I could tell you we've had great success and ease of use with both Altium for the embedded system design of the electronics, and we use SolidWorks, excellent package for mechanical layout and system design. So actually another question here was, will you be following up with a link of the recorded event? So we will be following up with an email containing the link to the webinar. And the last two things we wanted to mention, keep a lookout early in the new year for an invite for the second part of this webinar, where we're going to take a deep dive on stop 3, and we're going to invite Wolfgang from Matrix to the event, who will be able to elaborate and expand upon the integration of all the techniques that Barry and I talked about in the cloud, and they're able to customize that for you. Also, keep a lookout for a new insightful podcast series from Midi launched just today, which is a series of interviews with leaders of medtech accelerators and incubator centers. It's on our website, midipd.com, under our Innovation Vault. And so, Barry, I think that pretty much wraps it up.
I think it does. And if anyone, of course, has any questions on the regulatory quality side, feel free to contact us. I can tell you, working with Midi and working on these innovative technology type products, there's never one single recipe that works perfectly for everyone. But I think what you have between the two of us are really adaptable, strategic thinkers that can really help you deploy that product.
And we want to wish everybody a happy holidays.
Absolutely. Everybody, happy holidays, and hope to see you in the first quarter of next year.
Bye-bye.